My father asked me to change my wedding date so he could go camping with my brother. He thought I'd accept it like always. But this time I refused, and what happened next left everyone speechless. I'm 28 years old. I work in digital marketing, and like 3 months ago, I got married in a small ceremony in my backyard. You know, something intimate with about 30 people, nothing extravagant. But my father wasn't there, and it wasn't because he was sick or something serious happened to him. No, it was because he chose to go camping with my brother Edward instead of coming to my wedding. And when I say he chose to go camping, I mean he literally asked me to change the date of my wedding so he could go on the trip that Edward had organized. Can you believe it? I guess I should start from the beginning so you understand why this wasn't just some random thing that happened, but rather the straw that broke the camel's back after a lifetime of feeling invisible to my father. I grew up in a family that seemed normal from the outside, like middle class, house in the suburbs, 2 kids, dog included. My father Henry worked in finance, something corporate that I never fully understood, and my mother Diana was a nurse. Edward is 3 years older than me, so like when I was about 5 years old, he was already 8 and was the family's child prodigy. He got the best grades, was captain of the soccer team, won all the math competitions, basically the perfect son that all parents want to brag about at family gatherings. And me, well, I was the quiet girl who got good grades but not excellent ones, who played piano but never won competitions, who existed but never shone in the same way. It's not that my parents were bad to me or anything, they loved me and all that. But I always felt like Edward was the sun around which everyone revolved, and I was more like a distant moon that nobody noticed much. I remember perfectly when I was like 12 years old and I won a writing contest at school. Nothing super important, but for me it meant everything, because it was the first time I won anything. I came home super excited with the diploma and everything, and my father barely looked up from the newspaper, said something like, "Oh, that's nice, honey," and kept reading. That same week, Edward scored a goal in a soccer game, just one goal, and my father organized a family dinner to celebrate, invited the grandparents and everything. That kind of thing happened constantly. You know what I mean? It wasn't abuse or anything dramatic. It was just this constant feeling that I was in the background, that my achievements didn't matter as much, that Edward was simply more important. Things got complicated when I was like 16 and my parents got divorced. Turns out my mother had had an affair with a coworker from the hospital, and when my father found out, everything exploded. It was super ugly, like lawyers, custody battles, the whole drama. Edward was already 19 and in college, so technically he didn't need custody, but I did. In the end, it was decided that I would live with my father during the week and with my mother on weekends. But the truth is, my father was so submerged in his bitterness and pain that he basically ignored me more than before. He spent all his time working or locked in his study, and I spent those 2 years feeling like a piece of furniture in that house, something that's there but that nobody really sees. The ironic thing is that during all that time, Edward remained the undisputed favorite. My father called him constantly, went to visit him at college, attended all his important events. Meanwhile, I was at home dealing with all the emotional chaos of the divorce, practically alone. My mother, on her part, felt so guilty about the affair that she tried to compensate by being super permissive, but that didn't help much either, because what I needed was for someone to really see me, not for them to let me do whatever I wanted. It was a pretty lonely time, honestly, and I think that's when I started developing this emotional armor, like learning not to expect much from my father because that way I wouldn't be so disappointed. When I was 18, I met Steven, who was my mother's new boyfriend, and honestly, he was like a ray of light in the middle of all that mess. Steven was an engineer, also divorced, no kids of his own, and from the beginning he made an effort to really get to know me. He asked me about my day, about my plans for college, about what I liked to do, and most importantly, he actually listened to the answers. He wasn't invasive or trying to be my father. He was simply present. You know? He and my mother got married when I was 20, and by that time I already saw him as a much more present father figure than my own biological father. My mother died 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer. It was super fast and devastating. She was only 52 years old, and in like 8 months we went from diagnosis to funeral. During that time, Steven was incredible. He took leave from work to take care of her, was there every second, and was also there for me when I fell apart. My father showed up at the funeral, obviously, and Edward also came from London, where he was living at the time working at I don't know what super important consulting firm. But after the burial, they basically disappeared again. Stephen, on the other hand, continued being my family. We kept in constant contact. We have dinner together every 2 weeks. He's basically my dad in everything except biology. I fast forward to 4 years ago, when I met Jonathan at a work conference. He's a graphic designer, works freelance, and we connected immediately. Like that feeling of meeting someone and feeling like you already knew them before. We started dating, and it was the first relationship where I felt like someone really valued me, saw me completely, listened to me. Jonathan knew about my whole weird family dynamic from the beginning, and he's always been super understanding about the fact that my relationship with my father is complicated and distant. He never pressured me to fix things or made me feel guilty about keeping my distance. He just supported me in whatever I decided. About 8 months ago, Jonathan proposed to me during a weekend we spent at the beach. It was super romantic and emotional, and I obviously said yes because I couldn't imagine my life with anyone else. When we started planning the wedding, we decided we wanted something small and intimate. None of those mega weddings with 200 guests, just close family and important friends. We chose to have the ceremony in the backyard of our house because we had just bought a house with a beautiful garden, and we thought it would be perfect to have something there, like 30 people maximum, a short ceremony and then a casual dinner. We decided it would be on our 4-year anniversary, which fell on a Saturday in September, and we started planning everything with that date in mind. I told my father about the engagement over the phone because, well, that's our relationship. We're not ones to see each other much in person, he said. Congratulations and all that, asked when the wedding would be. I told him the date, and he said something like, perfect, I'll be there. Edward also found out, I don't know if through my father or because I mentioned it in the family WhatsApp group that we basically never use, and he sent a message like, congrats sis, but nothing more. Typical Edward, always super busy with his super important life in London to worry much about his little sister. Everything was going well. I mean, normal for me, which is having low expectations about my paternal family's participation. Until like 2 months before the wedding, my father called me on a Sunday afternoon. The conversation started normal. He asked how the plans were going. I told him about the catering and the flowers, and then he dropped the bomb. He told me, Charlotte, I have to ask you something, and I know it's going to sound weird, but is there any possibility that you could change the date of the wedding? I was like, what? And he explained that Edward had organized a camping trip with his college friends, something they had apparently been planning for months, and it turns out the trip was the same weekend as my wedding. And here comes the best part. My father told me that Edward really wanted him to go on that trip, because they were going to a super remote place in Scotland where Edward had been before and wanted to share that experience with his father, and that if I could change my wedding to the following weekend, he could go to both things. I couldn't believe it. I literally couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, Dad, are you asking me to change my wedding, which I've been planning for months, because Edward organized a camping trip? And he said, well, when you put it that way, it sounds bad. But the thing is, Edward already invested a lot of money in this trip, and all his friends already have plane tickets and everything. It would be very complicated for him to change the date. I felt like my head was going to explode. Like all that accumulated rage from years of feeling invisible was there in my throat. But instead of exploding, I said, let me think about it, and we'll talk later. I hung up the phone and started crying. I don't even know for how long. I just sat there on my living room couch crying because once again, Edward was more important. Edward's plans mattered more. Edward's happiness was worth more than mine. Jonathan came home like an hour later and found me still a mess on the couch. I told him what had happened, and he got furious, like angrier than I'd ever seen him, and told me that there was no way we were going to change the wedding date, that my father could choose, but that we weren't going to modify our plans for something so ridiculous. And he was right, obviously. But a part of me, that part that had been seeking my father's approval my whole life, considered changing the date just to avoid the conflict. I spent like 2 days thinking about it, talking about it with Jonathan, with Stephen, with my best friend, and everyone told me the same thing, that this was completely unacceptable, that my father should prioritize his daughter's wedding over a camping trip. On the 3rd day, I called my father and told him no, that I wasn't going to change the date of my wedding, that that was the date we had chosen, and that I expected to see him there. There was a long silence on the other side, and then he said, Charlotte, I understand you're upset, but can't you be a little more flexible? Edward really wants me to go on this trip? And there something in me broke. Or rather, something that had been broken for years, finally shattered. And I said, Dad, go on your camping trip, enjoy it with Edward. But then I'm also going to do something. I'm going to ask Stephen to walk me down the aisle. And he went quiet and then said, Stephen? Your mother's husband? And I said yes. Stephen? The man who has been there for me more than you in the last 10 years? He's going to walk me down the aisle. And I hung up before he could respond. I cried again after that call. But this time it was different. Like there was anger mixed with the pain. And there was also something like relief. As if I had finally taken a weight off my shoulders by stopping pretending that my relationship with my father was something it wasn't. I texted Stephen that same night, asking him if he would be willing to walk me down the aisle, and he called me immediately crying, told me it would be the greatest honor of his life, that he loved me like a daughter, that he had been waiting for years for me to see him as a father figure. It was one of the most emotional moments of this whole situation. Honestly, realizing that I had had a father all this time, just not the biological one. My father called me like 5 times that week, but I didn't answer. He sent me messages saying we needed to talk, that he didn't want things to be left like this, but I simply ignored him. Part of me felt guilty, like that little voice in my head that said maybe you're being too harsh with him. But the other part, the stronger part, knew this was necessary, that I had already given in enough in my life, that this time I wasn't going to give in. Jonathan supported me completely, told me every day that he was proud of me for setting boundaries, for standing up for myself, and that gave me strength to stay firm. The weeks passed, and the wedding day arrived. It was a perfect Saturday in September, like that ideal weather where it's neither too hot nor too cold. Stephen arrived early to help with the last details, and when he saw me in the dress, he started crying again, told me I looked beautiful, that my mother would be super proud. The garden was decorated beautifully, with hanging lights and flowers everywhere. We had like 25 or 30 people sitting in white chairs waiting for the ceremony to start. The music began, Stephen offered me his arm, and we walked together toward the altar where Jonathan was waiting for me with that smile that makes me melt. It was perfect. Literally perfect. The ceremony was short but emotional. We said our vows that we had written ourselves. We cried a little, laughed a little, and when the officiant said you may kiss, everyone applauded and cheered. During dinner, I kept thinking that my father wasn't there, that he had chosen a camping trip over this moment, but I tried not to let that ruin my day. Stephen made a beautiful toast where he talked about how proud he was of me, of the woman I had become, and said that although he hadn't seen me grow up from a child, he had had the privilege of seeing me become an adult, and that was enough for him. There wasn't a dry eye after that speech. I swear. At the end of the night, when everyone had left, and Jonathan and I were cleaning up a bit before going to bed, I decided to do something. I don't know if it was a good idea or not, but in the moment it seemed necessary. I asked Artenia, photographer, to send me a specific photo, the photo of Stephen walking me down the aisle, and I sent it to my father with a message that said, "Thanks for helping me realize who my family really is." I turned off my phone immediately after sending it because I didn't want to see his response, but Jonathan told me later that maybe it had been a bit cruel, and maybe he was right. But honestly, in that moment, I didn't care. The next morning, I turned on my phone and I had like 15 missed calls from my father and several messages. The messages started like, "Charlotte, please answer. I need to talk to you," and progressed to, "Charlotte, I made a terrible mistake. Please, let me fix it." The last message said, "I'm coming there. I'll be there in 2 hours." And sure enough, like 2 hours later, he rang my doorbell. Jonathan asked me if I wanted him to answer the door, but I told him no, that this was something I had to do myself. I opened the door, and there was my father, still in his camping clothes. He looked tired and disheveled, and his eyes were red like he had been crying. He said, "Charlotte, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I canceled the rest of the trip and drove all night to get here. Please tell me we can do another ceremony. Something small, just so I can be there, so I can walk you down the aisle." And I looked at him and felt so much anger mixed with sadness. Like this man was my father. He was supposed to love me and protect me and be there for me, but he had failed again and again and again. I said, "Dad, I already got married. There's not going to be a second ceremony." He started begging, literally begging, saying to please reconsider, that he would pay for everything, that he would invite whoever I wanted, that he would do whatever was necessary. But I just shook my head and told him, you know what the worst part of all this is? It's not just the wedding. It's a whole life of feeling like Edward was more important, of watching you go to all his soccer games, but never to my piano recitals, of how you celebrated each of his achievements but barely noticed mine, of how during the divorce you were so worried about Edward in college that you forgot you had a teenage daughter at home having a terrible time. And this asking me to change my wedding for a camping trip was just confirmation that I'm always going to be second after Edward. My father stood there in the entrance of my house and started crying, like sobbing, and told me, "You're right. You're completely right. I've been a terrible father to you and I don't know how to fix it, but please give me a chance." Seeing my father cry like that was surreal. I had never seen him so vulnerable, so broken, and part of me wanted to comfort him, but another stronger part stayed firm. I told him I needed time, that this wasn't something that could be fixed with an apology or with a second ceremony, that it was decades of accumulated pain, and that I couldn't just forgive him and move on as if nothing happened. He nodded and told me he understood, that he would wait as long as necessary, that he was going to work on being better, on being the father I should have had from the beginning. He left after that, and I stood there at the door watching him drive away in his car, feeling a bunch of emotions that I can't even describe well, like relief and guilt and sadness and liberation all at the same time. Jonathan hugged me and told me I had done the right thing, that setting boundaries didn't make me a bad person. And I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't stop wondering if I had been too harsh. The following days, my father sent me messages every day, nothing intense or invasive, just things like "thinking about you today," or "I hope you're well." I didn't answer any of them because Jonathan and I were going on our honeymoon to Italy, and I wanted to enjoy that time without all this family drama in my head. Before leaving, I sent my father a message asking him to please stop contacting me during the next 2 weeks, that I needed that time to be with my husband and process everything without distractions. And he responded that he understood and to enjoy my trip. Italy was incredible, like exactly what I needed to disconnect from everything. We visited Rome, Florence, and Tuscany, ate incredible pasta every day, drank wine, walked through ancient streets, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe without that weight on my chest. Jonathan was super patient with me, never mentioned the topic of my father unless I wanted to talk about it, and basically let me process everything at my own pace. It was perfect, honestly, and it made me realize that I had made the right decision in marrying him, that this was the family I had chosen, and that chose me too. But of course, peace couldn't last forever. Halfway through the honeymoon, I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I don't answer unknown numbers, but for some reason, I answered this time, and it was Edward. Turns out he had bought a burner phone because he knew I wouldn't answer if I saw it was him. He said, "Charlotte, we need to talk about Dad." And I said, "Edward, I'm on my honeymoon. This can wait." But he insisted, told me no, it couldn't wait, that Dad was devastated, that he had been crying every day since the wedding, that I was being cruel and vindictive, that family was the most important thing, and that I was destroying our family on a whim. I felt my blood boil, like all that rage I had been containing came out all at once. And I yelled at him, "Family? You're talking to me about family? Where was that family when I needed support during our parents' divorce? Where were you when I spent weekends alone because Dad was too busy visiting you at college? Where was Dad in all my important moments during the last 28 years?" And Edward told me I was exaggerating, that Dad had always been there for me, that I was seeing things from a victimized perspective, and that I needed to grow up and forgive. I told him to fuck off and hung up. I blocked the burner number immediately. Jonathan asked me what had happened, and when I told him, he was furious, told me that Edward had no right to call me during our honeymoon, much less use a burner phone to ambush me. He was right, obviously. But the rest of the trip was kind of tainted by that conversation. I couldn't help but keep thinking about the things Edward had said, wondering if I really was exaggerating, if I was being too harsh with my father. When we came back from Italy, I felt more confused than before. On one hand, I was super happy about my marriage and about having set boundaries with my father, but on the other hand, I couldn't stop feeling guilt. That typical guilt that comes when you defy your family, when you stop being the compliant daughter who never causes problems. I talked a lot with Stephen about it, and he told me something that stuck with me. He said, "Charlotte, loving someone doesn't mean letting them hurt you again and again, and forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or pretending the damage never existed." After thinking about it a lot, like 2 weeks after coming back from the trip, I decided to go see my father at his house. I texted him to let him know I was going to come, and he responded immediately saying, "Please, yes, whenever I wanted." that he would be there. I drove to his house on a Saturday afternoon, and when I arrived, he came out to meet me at the door. He looked older than I remembered. More tired. I don't know, more human, I guess. We went inside and sat in the living room, and there was an uncomfortable silence for a moment before I started talking. I said, "Dad, I came because I need you to understand some things. Not so you feel worse, but so you really comprehend why I'm so hurt." And I proceeded to tell him everything. Absolutely everything. Every moment of my childhood where I felt invisible. Every time he chose Edward over me. Every achievement of mine that went unnoticed while Edward's were celebrated as if they were national events. I talked to him about the divorce and how alone I felt. About how Stephen had been more of a father to me than him in the last 10 years. About how the wedding was just the straw that broke the camel's back after years of accumulation. My father cried again. Told me he hadn't realized. That he thought I was fine. That I was independent and didn't need as much from him as Edward did. And there's the problem, I told him. You assumed that because I wasn't as demanding as Edward. Because I didn't need as much attention. I didn't need anything. But everyone needs to know they're important to their parents, that they're seen and valued. I told him I wasn't looking for him to choose between Edward and me. I just wanted him to see me too, to recognize that I existed and that my feelings mattered. He apologized to me, told me that if he could turn back time, he would do everything differently, that he deeply regretted having failed me. I believed him, I think. The truth is, I could see the genuine remorse in his eyes, but I also knew that regret didn't erase the damage, didn't heal decades-old wounds. I told him I wasn't ready to have a close relationship with him again, but that I also didn't want to cut him completely out of my life, that maybe we could start over little by little, without expectations, just seeing how things developed. He agreed, told me he accepted whatever I decided, that he would be there when I was ready, that he wasn't going to pressure me. We established some boundaries, like that we would see each other once a month for lunch, nothing more, and that I didn't want to talk about Edward during those lunches unless it was something really important. I also made it clear to him that if he ever prioritized Edward over me again in such an obvious way, I would cut contact permanently, and he promised me it wouldn't happen again. I don't know how all this is going to end. Honestly, it's been like 3 months since that conversation, and we've had 2 lunches so far, both a bit awkward, but not terrible. My father is making a genuine effort. He asks about my life, about my work. He seems really interested in listening to the answers. But I also know that damaged relationships don't get fixed overnight, that this is going to take years probably, and that maybe I'll never have the father-daughter relationship that other people have. And that's okay. I guess. I've learned to be at peace with that. Edward and I haven't spoken since that call on my honeymoon. I know he's still in London, still being the perfect son for my father, and honestly, I don't care. I think Edward and I were never really close. There always existed this implicit competition for our father's attention, although I stopped competing years ago. I don't have resentment toward him, honestly. I rather feel sorry for him because he's so emotionally stunted that he can't see beyond his own privileged to bubble. Jonathan and I are happy. We're considering the possibility of having children soon. And when I think about being a mother, I think about how I want to be different from my father. How I want to make sure all my children know they're equally important, equally loved, equally seen. Stephen is going to be an incredible grandfather. He's already super excited about the idea, and that makes me happy. Knowing that my future children are going to have at least one grandfather who really values them. Last week, my father called me to tell me he had started therapy, that his therapist had helped him see patterns in his behavior that he had never recognized before, and that he wanted me to know he was working on being better. It was a short but meaningful conversation, and for the first time, I felt some hope that maybe, just maybe, we can build something new on the ruins of what never was. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully forgive him, or if our relationship will ever be what it comes. You should have been. But I'm open to the possibility, and I guess that's enough for now.